Welcome to today's webinar, Cybersecurity 102. This webinar is presented by Ahola Human Capital Management and Meyers, Roman, Friedberg, and Lewis. This webinar will be 1 hour in length and include a slide presentation and worksheet, which was sent in your webinar reminder email you should have received this morning. Throughout the presentation, we will also encourage listeners to submit questions to our presenters via the chat function of WebEx. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be emailed to all registrants with the presentation slides and worksheet referenced. Now to the introduction. My name is Lori Slesh, Strategic Planning Director for Ahola Human Capital Management, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to our webinar panelists today. On today's panel, we have Peter Bross. With more than 30 years of experience in the roles of trusted advisor, outside general counsel, and legal resource to closely held businesses, Peter identifies business and legal implications associated with clients' legal options and advises them of solutions that address their business and personal needs. He represents clients in a broad scope of industries ranging from consumer and automotive companies to private equity groups and real estate developers and investors. Peter counsels clients on matters involving business succession, ownership and management issues, contracts, contract disputes, domestic and international mergers and acquisitions, real estate purchases, construction and development, recapitalization, sales, leasing, financing, representing both lenders and borrowers, and like-kind exchanges. His practice also includes matters involving cybersecurity, energy law involving oil and gas leasing and related business transactions, renewable energy, environmental law, and computer and intellectual property law. Our second panelist is David Croft. As a former general counsel and chief operating officer, David offers a unique perspective on applying business law and understanding the needs of his clients. David's practice includes counseling businesses and entrepreneurs through northeastern Ohio to launch new businesses and purchase or sell existing businesses, reviewing investment opportunities, establishing internal governance mechanisms, developing agreements with customers and other businesses, preparing and negotiating business deals and contracts, and handling dissolution and liquidation matters. David brings extensive experience in the manufacturing industry and represents a diverse array of businesses, business owners, and entrepreneurs. David is the chair of his firm's blockchain and cryptocurrency practice group and draws on his specialized technical and business expertise to better represent his clients in all aspects of blockchain technology and cryptocurrency, including data privacy, cybersecurity, inventions, trademarks, brand protection, trade secrets, copyrights, commercialization, mining, energy procurement, and licensing. Our third panelist is John Hyman. John has spent his entire career solving employers' workforce problems, focusing his practice on management-side labor and employment law. His experience covers all areas of labor and employment law, including significant trial experience at both boutique and general practice law firms. John serves as an outside labor and employment counsel for businesses by drafting employment policies and agreements, auditing human resource practices, advising on day-to-day employment issues such as employee discipline and terminations, monitoring labor relations and implementing union avoidance strategies, conducting workplace investigations, ensuring compliance with labor and employment laws, and assisting companies with their cybersecurity conformity. Welcome, gentlemen, and thanks for being here. So let's get started. As you can see, we've got the agenda for the webinar on the screen. We will discuss managing cybersecurity risk. We will read through a cybersecurity fact pattern based on a local manufacturing company and discuss the example in depth with our panelists. Then we'll wrap it all up and take questions from the audience. And with that, I'll turn the webinar over to you, Peter, to get started.
Thanks, Lori. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today and attending Cybersecurity 102, the second part of a three-part program by Meyers, Roman, and Ahola. If you didn't hear the part one, you can do so on either Meyers, Roman's website or Ahola's website. Forbes projects that the cost of cybersecurity in the United States would jump from $40 billion in 2013 to $66 billion in 2018. 200 risk managers surveyed in North America 53% of them stated that cyber attacks and risk of business interruption, damages to reputation was one of the leading top risks that they're dealing with. Today we are going to discuss what to do and prepare for cyber threats or risk management. We prepared a fact pattern, which is the same fact pattern as in part one, that represents many of your businesses as a manufacturer or distributor. Willis Reed Company, located in an industrial park in Cleveland, Ohio, is a manufacturer and distributor of widgets. The widgets are used in industry and by consumers. WRC's consumers pay using credit cards, wire transfers, and checks. WRC also has certain products manufactured in China. Communication to and from the factory in China is done primarily through email and text. The manufacturer in China is not owned by WRC and has its own computer system and server that is located in China. WRC recently updated its equipment and is completely automated. The equipment is operated through embedded software applications. Part of the equipment operation and maintenance procedures require that software applications are updated routinely through its internal Wi-Fi network. WRC has approximately 20 employees. 10 of its employees work in Cleveland, Ohio location. Other employees are located in several locations throughout the United States, and some of the employees work from their employees' home. At times, WRC will hire independent contractors. Some of the employees, independent contractors, are provided company-owned cell phones and laptops. However, many of the employees and independent contractors use their own personal cell phones, computers, laptops, and the like when performing duties for WRC. The employees and independent contractors remotely access WRC's computer system to use applications and input orders and other information required to perform their work. WRC sells its widgets in the United States primarily. However, WRC intends to expand worldwide and has opportunities to sell into the European Union. Many of the orders taken by WRC are submitted through the WRC website. WRC recently hired a website development company to redevelop its website and to establish a store and online marketing strategy through a third party like Amazon. WRC has been hosting its website on its own server located in Cleveland, Ohio. WRC purchases its materials used in manufacturing from vendors who are generally small companies. Some of the vendors are outside the United States. Many of the vendors require WRC to order its materials through their websites. All WRC company information, financial plans, specifications, trade secrets with regard to the business are stored on its server. Also, customer lists and contact information obtained when taking orders and the methods of payment are also stored on WRC's server. WRC's president has been considering storing company data and transactions in the cloud, but isn't sure exactly what that means. WRC's accountant has advised that WRC use an accounting application that is in the cloud. The application is licensed from a well-known accounting software company located in the United States. The accounting software company also arranges for data storage. WRC has been approached by a potential new large customer to manufacture a product line and also distribute its product to its customers who are primarily consumers. The new customer's products are sold to customers in the EU, Canada, and the United States. The new customer provided WRC with its master manufacturing and services agreement. WRC's president is reviewing the agreement and noticed that there are 4 pages under a section captioned Data Privacy and Cybersecurity. President of WRC is confused and not sure what the next step should be. So John, WRC has 20 employees. So the employees have no issue, correct, as it relates to cyber concerns?
No, that's very incorrect. The issue, the employees have every issue when it comes to the company's cybersecurity. There are kind of a ton of studies that are out there talking about what a company's biggest exposure point is to being hacked by some cyber criminal looking to do bad to the organization. And the numbers kind of range, but at the top of every list is a company's employees. So I've seen numbers that range anywhere from 40% all the way up to 70%, depending on what study you read. But they all say that your number one risk factor for whether or not or when you're going to fall victim to a cyber criminal is your employees. And we're not just talking about, and we're primarily not talking about the employee that is looking to steal from you, that is looking to give away your trade secrets and other secret sauce to your competitors, to the disgruntled, angry employee that wants to do damage to you because they got passed over for a promotion or didn't get a raise or they don't like their boss or whatever. Most of the employee risk factors come not from an employee looking to do bad, but come from employees that just don't know. Common mistakes, negligence, employees that are careless in how they go about accessing your network, accessing your data, reading emails, and are through their own negligence and carelessness, not through their intent, are exposing your organization. So what I recommend to companies is that just like you have your anti-sexual harassment policy and have your leave of absence policy and have your attendance policy, that you also have for your employees cyber policies in place to give them guidance on how they should be appropriately accessing your network. So I'll talk about each kind of the pieces and parts of this in some amount of detail, but we're talking about things like password protocols and some guidance for how employees should be accessing Wi-Fi networks when they're out of the office, email protocols to keep employees safe from phishing efforts, things like what to do if a device gets lost or stolen, what devices they're connecting to your network, and do you allow employees to connect non-employer owned or controlled devices, whether it's a mobile phone or a USB drive or an external hard drive. All things to consider when you're educating your employees, setting up policies, protocols, practices for how employees are going to access your network and access your data. So we can go through, each one of them in some detail, but we talk about things like password security. If you surveyed your employees as to what their password is to access your network, if you don't have controls in place to monitor and restrict what passwords they're using, you would find, I'm guessing, based on the literature and the studies and my experience, that a majority of them, if not a solid majority of them, number one, have used the same password throughout their employment. They've never changed it. Number two, that at least some of them have passwords like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or password all lowercase, which are the two most common passwords in use across the country, period. What's interesting, though, is so the password, the word password, all lowercase, that can be hacked in something like a few hundredths of a second by a cyber criminal. If you just change the O in password from a lowercase o to a capital O, you now take that up from fractions of a second to minutes. If you add an ASCII character somewhere in there and a number, you've now gone maybe to days or weeks or months or even years or centuries to crack that password. Just like you would never leave the front door to your business unlocked when you go home at night, allowing employees to have passwords like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or password is really no different. So what I recommend to my clients is that they require passwords of sufficient 12 characters, 14 characters, 16 characters in length with a mix of lowercase letters, capital letters, numbers, and ASCII characters. The longer a password is and the more variants of types of characters, the harder it is for a password to be cracked. There's websites out there that will, if you type your password in, that will tell you how long it would take for someone to crack that password. Mine, it tells me, would take 16 billion years for someone to crack. So I feel reasonably certain that my password is safe. But that said, we require, and I suggest that my clients require passwords to be changed at least annually, because accounts get hacked all the time, passwords get compromised all the time, and so you want to make sure that password is being changed at least on an annualized basis, so that to give you that added layer of security. Recommend that passwords not be reused from account to account. If your employee's network password to get onto your network is the same as their Gmail password, and their Gmail gets hacked, guess what also got hacked? Your network. So you want to make sure that the employees' passwords are not just sufficiently complex and changed regularly, but are not repeated, that it is a password unique to your network and your network only, such that if one of their other accounts gets compromised, it's not going to compromise the integrity of your network as well. And we're not just talking about things like your phone, like your mobile devices, your computers, but check the Internet of Things. What things are connected to your network? Is your copy machines, there are Wi-Fi connected coffee pots and crock pots and microwaves now. Whatever devices are attached to your network, make sure that you have changed the default passwords that come on those devices as well, because otherwise anybody with that device is going to know what your password is, because the default passwords are typically all the same for those devices. When we talk about Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi is extraordinarily dangerous, because when someone logs on to a public Wi-Fi network, depending on the network, all the data that flows through that device that's logged onto that network is likely exposed unless that network is otherwise secured. When we had the RNC here in Cleveland a few summers ago, a cybersecurity vendor did a little experiment. They went out onto the square between Progressive Field and Quicken Loans Arena, set up public Wi-Fi networks with names designed to lure convention goers to log onto the networks. They were like Trump 2016 or No Hillary or Google Starbucks were three of the network names they used to try to lure people to log onto those networks. And they set up shop for an hour. In that hour, 1,200 people logged on to those public Wi-Fi networks, and of those 1,200 people, more than two-thirds, or around 68%, exposed information not only on their devices but on the networks, their corporate networks to which those devices were connected through those public Wi-Fi networks. So it is extraordinarily dangerous if your employees are using public Wi-Fi to either connect their laptop or connect their iPhone or Android or whatever they're doing. We all look for those hotspots because we're all concerned we don't want to use up data on our devices. But what we should be doing rather than connecting to public Wi-Fi is either using hotspots on our mobile devices, which are secure, or we should be getting our employees virtual private networks or VPNs to log on to our networks through, so that even if we're on a public Wi-Fi, the VPN essentially envelops all the data that transmits through that network in a bubble of security, such that even on a public Wi-Fi, the cyber criminal shouldn't be able to penetrate that VPN to get on, to pierce the device. And if your employees are need that public Wi-Fi in a pinch. They really need to verify that the network that they're logging onto is a secure network. Just because a network calls itself Starbucks doesn't mean it is a local Starbucks. Starbucks has some kind of security in their network, in their public Wi-Fi. This does require you to log on, click through a site to get onto the network. So there is a level of security on there, but just because a network calls itself Starbucks doesn't mean it is Starbucks, because if you've ever set up a router in your house, you know that you can call that router anything you want. So just because it's called Starbucks doesn't mean it is. The top, and I'll close talking about phishing, the top means that cyber criminals are using to get on to get onto your networks to launch cyber attacks is through phishing emails. A phishing email is an email that's designed to look like a legitimate email, so that someone, quote, takes the bait, clicks on that email, and the link that they're clicking on is not the link to reset their PayPal password or the link to reset their Amazon password or to get into their bank account because it looks like it's from Chase or Citibank, but rather is a link that takes you to a website controlled by a cyber criminal that's going to install malware or ransomware or some other cyber oogly boogly technical term that's going to wreak havoc on your network. So your employees need to be trained to recognize what a phishing email is and to avoid it at all costs. The studies show that untrained employees will, at a 25% response rate, click on a link in a phishing email. They won't recognize it as an attempt to phish. Training brings that response rate down to as low as 2%. So it's not perfect, and the attacks have gotten more and more sophisticated through designing the emails to look like they are coming from one of your coworkers, for example, or with information that the cyber criminals learn through social engineering. That is, they go on your social profiles on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, what have you, pick up information about you specifically, and then specifically target the phishing email to you based on your personal information to make it more likely that you will click on that email. Your employees need to be specifically trained on what these emails look like, because if they're not, they will be clicking on those links, which is going to then download and install things like malware, ransomware, viruses, etc. On your network, which the average cost to remedy a cyber attack is approaching $4 million, and that could potentially be what you're looking at if one of your employees doesn't recognize a phishing email and clicks on one of those links.
Thanks, John. So obviously, technology is the centerpiece of these issues when considering cybersecurity. So, David, is there some way we can determine whether or not our technology is up to snuff and is not an open door for cyber criminals?
Sure. So a lot of folks may have heard of a cyber audit or cybersecurity audit. There's companies out there that perform this service for businesses, and essentially, let me just start by saying that not all cyber audit firms are created equal. The second thing I'll say is that cyber audits typically have two pieces. I like to look at cybersecurity as kind of a three-pronged approach. Number one is the shield. So the first part of that is what John's already talked about. It's looking at the employees, dealing with the policies, and then the other part of that is having an audit conducted. The second prong, I guess, would be shifting liabilities. We talk about that a little later, and that would be specifically in a business's agreements or contracts. And then the last prong would be the net, and that's cyber insurance. We may talk about that as well. So if the cyber criminal gets past the shield, hopefully you have a net there to catch you and you've shifted the liability sufficiently. But getting back to the audit, audits can be tailored to the business. It also depends on what the firm conducting the audit is capable of doing. There's usually two pieces. Number one is more of a legal or quasi-legal component. We may partner with different audit firms to assess the policies, the employment policies, assess the agreements that a company is currently in with other businesses, and potentially look at some of the other things internally in an entity. But the technological aspect is usually done by a cyber security audit firm, and their main goal is to provide the company's management with an assessment of the policies and procedures, the operating effectiveness, identifying internal control and regulatory deficiencies. And they can do this through any number of ways. One is what's called a penetration or point of access test, and usually they'll utilize software, either theirs or licensed software, to access or try to access the company and determine where all the openings are that someone could get in. Another thing that they'll do is they'll review the company's internal software, servers, all of the IT stuff, and determine whether or not those are sufficient for what the company's doing, where the company's active. They'll look at the data loss prevention measures that the company may have or may be missing, network access controls, any kind of detection systems that the company may have to let the company know that someone has or is trying to gain access, security controls, and then something that we'll be talking about in the next series or the next webinar, which is the audit company will likely assist with creating an incident response program. So that's...
And one of the things that I'll just add is that depending on the company, somebody like WRC may want to have an assessment of its suppliers and their network, because perhaps they can't get to WRC, but a hacker can go through one of their suppliers and find their way in, which is how some of the major breaches that you've read about have occurred.
One other point that I'll interject here is we actually had this with one of our clients recently, and they were contacted by one of their customers, and everyone's worried about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU. They had a customer contact them and say, what are you doing to comply with this? Not whether you're applicable or not, or whether it's applicable to you or not. It's what are you doing to comply with this? And it was a large customer, so they had to go out immediately and hire an audit firm that prepared a report for them to use to show people that they were compliant. But that's also a consideration with respect to the audit. You're getting reports. Someone's handing you something that says, here's your risks, here's what you're doing to comply, and companies may want to have that in hand, whether they're dealing with their customers or looking to buy or sell.
So I know that with non-cyber risks, many companies have catastrophe plans in case something terrible happens. With the case of cybersecurity, is there such thing as a cybersecurity data privacy plan?
Absolutely. So, and this may be a good segue into the current statutes, unless we're going to talk about that later.
No, I think it's all part of the same thing.
So the cybersecurity plan, essentially, if we're talking about an incident response plan, is that what we're...
I'm saying from a standpoint of starting with the policies and how you're going to monitor into, and obviously your response would be part of that plan.
Right. So there are, and a cyber audit can also assist with this, but there are, I would say 7 or 8 off the top of my head plans that a company can implement. One plan that is probably familiar to most businesses, especially in this neck of the woods, because they may be dealing with health records, is HIPAA's plan, or what's a build off of that is the high-tech plan, which is a plan by the federal government, essentially a set of requirements that a company has to follow to comply with the federal government and protect personally identifiable health information. Dovetailing with plans of this nature, there are also plans that have been put out by NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Dovetailing with this is what is a safe harbor in the state of Ohio that became active November 2nd of 2018. And essentially what that says statutorily, and if those of you that are really interested in looking at statutes, it's codified in Section 1354 of the Ohio Revised Code. It creates a safe harbor for a business that implements and follows one of these plans. And the safe harbor is this: if the business is breached and personal information is accessed, it protects the business from a tort cause of action by an individual whose information may have been stolen.
So a tort would be negligence, for example.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
And
you had a duty to protect my personal information. You did something that breached that duty, therefore you're liable to me.
but the law is specific in that it has to be in writing, it has to be complied with, and that the business has to comply with one of 6 standards, and the standards are in, they're typically industry type related standards. If you do that, then that is one way of having an affirmative defense in the case you're sued.
But let me just say, though, that Ohio is only one of 50 states. And I'm not saying that companies should not, NIST or HIPAA if you're a healthcare provider, or Graham-Leach-Bliley if you're a financial institution, they all publish standards that are great benchmarks to follow regardless of this safe harbor. But Ohio is just one of 50 states. There is no federal cybersecurity law currently. So there are 50 different potentially 50 different cybersecurity standards across the 50 states, 50 different jurisdictions in which a company can be sued, and as far as I know, Ohio is the only jurisdiction that has a law like this that provides this safe harbor. So it gives some relief, but companies should not look at this should not look at this safe harbor to give them a false sense of security that just because they are compliant with one of these standards that they can forget about everything else.
That's true, but that's where the plan, a cyber plan, is very helpful to a company, because it's sort of the map of what it has to do on a day-to-day basis for protection from a technology perspective, from a policy perspective, and then what happens if there's breach. Just as an aside, in January of this year, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services created standards for healthcare businesses, best practices. And if you go to the Department of Health and Human Services website, it's a 4-volume report. You'll be able to access those. So, John, there's insurance for everything. Is there insurance for cyber?
There is insurance for cyber, but you better know what you're buying, because what you're buying may protect you, and it may not protect you in the event of a breach. There is, I would say that companies should be looking at cyber insurance as part of their overall suite of insurance products, just like they have premises liability insurance and general business insurance and E&O insurance and employment practices liability insurance. And all the other insurance products that companies, when they talk to their broker and go to market to renew their insurance policies, or say we want to make sure that we are covered kind of lock, stock, and barrel, top to bottom in our business. And I think it has become increasingly apparent as more and more businesses, both publicly and not so publicly, are being breached, that businesses need to have cyber insurance in their arsenal of insurance, insurance, to use David's term, kind of the safety net product.
What should it cover generally? What kind of coverages should?
So, I mean, there are, the coverage is only, again, I mean, you need to make sure you know what you're buying. So you need to know, for example, is it going to cover the type of data that you're handling, for example? If you are a healthcare provider, you want to make sure there's not exclusions in the policy for your patient's health information, for example. You want to know kind of what cost it's going to cover in the event of a breach. I said before, the cost of a data breach is now approaching close to $4 million on average per breach. That not only includes things like the technological remediation of the breach itself, but also notice to affected consumers or clients or customers, professional service fees, hiring the IT professionals and the lawyers to take care of all this for you, reputational harm to your business, business interruption, are all costs that kind of go into that. What is that $4 million average cost comprised of? And you need to make sure that your insurance is going to cover each and every one of those potential line item costs. The forensic investigation, the remediation to protect any or to fix any problems on your network, notification costs to consumers whose data might have been compromised, data restoration costs for any data that was lost, stolen, altered, what have you, business interruption costs if you're down because your network is down or it's locked up by ransomware, legal costs, and the public relation costs all go into the kind of your first party costs in terms of your breach. You want to make sure that it covers things like, what if you were not the entity that was breached, but what if the Target's the most famous data breach, and the cyber criminal got into Target through Target's HVAC vendor that hooked a device up to Target's HVAC system. That device was compromised, and that's how the cyber criminal got in. If it's a third party that causes the breach, is your insurance going to pay for that, even if it's your network that is ultimately compromised and provides the biggest risk? What devices are covered? Are mobile devices covered? Are desktop or laptop computers covered? Is it just your network itself that's covered? Are thumb drives and other removable storage covered? Are all types of claims covered? Are not just private claims brought by individuals, but are claims by regulators or government agencies covered? And most recently, a company that manufactures Nabisco, or that manufactures Oreos rather, was hacked. It's going to cost them, they estimate, $100 million to remedy the situation. And their insurance carrier is denying coverage on the basis that the genesis of the hack appears to come from Russia, and the policy specifically excludes intentional acts by a foreign government. And so the insurance carrier is taking the position that if this was a state-sponsored hack at the hands of the Russian government, then it is specifically excluded under the policy, and the insured is going to have zero coverage for its $100 million loss. And so there's now litigation pending between the insurer and its insurance carrier over the scope of the coverage. So the devil's in the details. You can go out and buy a cyber insurance policy tomorrow, But my recommendation is that you don't purchase that policy until you have a detailed conversation both with your insurance broker so they know what needs to be covered, and likely with your counsel as well, so that you can have an informed discussion and an informed understanding of exactly what it is that you are buying, so that you have the most confidence in the event that you are breached. And we say this all the time, but it's not an if issue but a when issue. When you are breached, that your insurance coverage that you're paying for is actually going to provide you the coverage that you need.
I'll just add two things. One, a company like WRC, where they're doing work in China, the issue of this acts of war or foreign government attack becomes very important, as well as making sure that you have regulatory insurance or insurance against breaches of the GDPR, because this company was going to do business in the EU. So it's gotten more complicated, and something that needs to clearly business needs to acquire. But just because you have insurance, I assume you'll both agree that you don't stop there. You need the plans, you need the policies.
Yeah. Your insurance should never be your kind of we have it so forget about it plan. The insurance should be your matter of last resort.
And don't forget, we're also talking about dollars and cents here. When we deal with small to medium-sized businesses, someone in a small to medium-sized business looks at a $40 million regulatory fine or a lawsuit as, well, I'm going out of business, so what do I care anyway? The thing that those types of businesses has to focus on as well, you're looking at loss of reputation here too, right? So your customers, suppliers, vendors, whatever, they see that you're not following this stuff. They see that you get breached. They see that you're any of these things could happen. Maybe it's not a dollars and cents issue anymore. Maybe it's your reputation and your relationship with your customers, clients, suppliers, vendors, et cetera.
So we appreciate you listening. I think what's made clear is that where 10 years ago or maybe even 5 years ago, a business didn't have to have a budget line item for cybersecurity and data privacy, that isn't the case today. That we must take steps to mitigate this risk. So we again appreciate you listening. The third part of the webinar series will deal with what if you're breached, what steps you take.
Well, thanks, Peter, David, and John. Lots to consider. We have a couple questions. We definitely have time for questions from the audience. We have a couple popping up now, and so we should take some of those questions. Let's see what we have. So one of the questions is, do you recommend the use of two-factor authentication?
I do, but it's not foolproof, and you shouldn't just say because I have two-factor authentication active for my account that I don't have to worry about my account being compromised. Two-factor authentication, for those that are unaware, is a second layer of security on your online account, such that, for example, if I have two-factor authentication, which I do, on my Gmail account, if I log on to my Gmail from a new device, with my password, it won't let me log on until I get until I type in a code that's sent to another device. So I have that tied to my mobile phone number, so I'll get a 6-digit code texted to my mobile device that will then won't let me access it until I enter that code as well. It is certainly not foolproof. There are ways that two-factor authentication can be gotten around. For example, if your Gmail is the account that's compromised, somebody can go in, a cyber criminal can go in and change your two-factor authentication method such that the message is going to go to them and not to you. So that there are ways that cyber criminals can get around the two-factor authentication. Not a foolproof method, but any layer of security is certainly going to be a benefit. So I recommend that companies use it and require it, but it is certainly not a 100% kind of lock, stock, and barrel foolproof method. I also recommend, for example, things like password services like LastPass or 1Password, that it'll store kind of all of your passwords for all of your accounts. It'll let you set up random passwords for all your various accounts online, and then you have one master password when you're online that will unlock kind of your passwords on a site-by-site basis. Again, the concern is, well, what if LastPass or 1Password is hacked? That is certainly possible. However, when you look at kind of what's the best way to go about storing all these passwords, if it's I'm going to use the same password for every device, or I'm going to keep them written down in a notebook that I keep in my desk drawer, which a lot of people do, or I'm going to use like 1Password or LastPass with this, with a secure encrypted password. That's by far going to be the best practice. Again, not foolproof. There is all this stuff. Anything you do online carries risk, but in the spectrum of risk, it is by far the lowest.
Any other questions?
Great. Yes, we have another question. So we've shared the cost of some of these possible hacks. We're talking $4 million, and we've talked about some of the things we want to put in our insurance policy and plans. What do you see as the range costing the employer for these plans, a cyber plan, or I just want to get started. What is the cost of an audit?
So there's a huge range. Obviously, it depends on what the company is doing. Obviously, Willis Reed has a lot more potential exposure than some other companies. So it depends on what the business is doing, number of employees. It depends on a lot of things. But I guess if you're looking for a middle of the road, from very, very small to very, very large, you're looking anywhere between $7,000 to $10,000 on average. And again, I wouldn't want anyone on the call to walk into a cyber audit firm and say, I want a cyber audit for $7,000, because they might be overpaying. I'm guessing they probably, are not. But that's just a very, very, very middle of the road, $7,000 to $10,000 range.
All right. So if I already have a plan, how do I know that I'm covered?
So well, I guess it depends on what plan we're talking about here. So if we're talking about employment policy plans, you would want to have someone like John take a look at it. If we're talking about the more technical nature plans, you would likely want to have the cyber audit firm in conjunction with your legal representation come in and take a look at it. And that's, you're not just looking at the technical aspects. You're also you're doing a deep dive on some of the agreements. By the way, I'm finding much, much more now than I have ever before. People used to look at data protection as a throwaway in a contract, and it wasn't really a shift of liability. No one really focused on it. Nowadays, companies, you really have to start looking at your agreements, because they're shifting. John mentioned average $4 million liability. They're shifting that liability contractually, and so pay attention to that. Make sure your attorneys are paying attention to that. And then finally, when we're talking about a plan, if we're talking about an insurance policy, that is something for both your attorney and your insurance professional to take a look at. And I guess it's a good segue for me to say and add to John's insurance comments. Make sure that your insurance professional knows what you're doing. If, for example, Willis Reed left out that they're storing client data on their servers that are hosted in-house or via the cloud, that's a big issue. Your insurance professional needs to know what you're doing in order to make sure you're covered adequately. And so does your attorney, for that matter, to make sure that the policy says what it or covers what you're doing.
All right, and I think we have one last question. All good starting points of having insurance. We need to make sure we have our T's and crossed and I's dotted with our vendors. And so, I think the other point is, John mentioned that the employees are the number one possible place where this hacking or phishing is going to start. So what does it look like in your employee training program? Do you see this, showing this webinar, to your employees, or is this an ongoing every month kind of activity? How do we train our employees to be more aware?
I think it's a combination. I think what your organization wants to do is start creating a culture of cyber awareness among your employees, so that this is something that is their key role in protecting the cyber resources of your organization are in the forefront of their mind. And you can do that any number of ways. Training is certainly an important component of it, and organizations that aren't training their employees on cybersecurity, I think, are missing the point and doing their folks a disservice. It's not enough just to have, as it is with any policy, it's not enough to have the policy if your employees never read it, don't understand it, or got no training on it. And so just like we do or should be doing things like annual anti-harassment training or annual respectful workplace training, those kind of things, we should be building a cyber component into the annualized training that we're providing our employees. And I realize that training and training budgets are largely contingent upon, the size of the organization. So, your big Fortune whatever companies are going to have sophisticated online training modules such that you won't be able to even log on to the network when you get to your desk in the morning until you complete this training component that certifies that you've done email phishing training, and you can recognize what a phishing email looks like, for example. But at the bare minimum, you should be sitting your folks down, in a conference room with someone like me, having a conversation with them and explaining to them kind of what all this stuff means and why it's something they should be focused on, so that, when they have to reset their password, they understand why they're resetting it, or when they get the email, they'll be able to recognize what it is. And then once that training's in place, you can then reinforce it throughout the year with positive reinforcement messages for your employees, like so-and-so just received the following phishing email. If you get a similar email, please disregard it, and, bravo to Jane Doe for, being cyber aware and recognizing this was an email that she should not click on, and doing the right things by, alerting the HR department and the IT manager or whatever. So that making sure that these messages that are being delivered in your training are being reinforced with employees throughout the year.
Great, thanks. I think that's it from a question perspective. Anyone online has further questions, obviously you can pick up the phone, call any one of you to get started, or if they're already started, to see if they're on the right path, which is great. So I want to thank Peter, Dave, and John, thank you for joining us online today. And this webinar and its contents will be sent to all registrants. We will also be sending the dates and registration for the final webinar in the series that you definitely don't want to miss to all registrants. And have a great rest of your day.